Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you for joining us. As I said in our first hour, happy Bill of Rights Day. This is the 234th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, December 15th, 1791. Do you ever wonder about what we've been told by the powers that be in regards to how our federal government is supposed to work? Is the overbearing, incompetent, corrupt, tax-sucking federal government we have experienced all of our lives really what our founders risked their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor for? Was the Supreme Court really intended to be the final arbiter of all constitutional questions? Was it intended that the federal government be so involved in our lives and the states are just mere agents of the federal government? If you've watched this show very long, then you probably already know that the answer to all this is no. However, the particular design and intent of our Constitution is important as it is understanding how things got off track, who the culprits were, and how to fix it. Our guest tonight is Dave Benner, author of the book Compact of the Republic, the League of States and the Constitution. Now, I read a lot about the Constitution, but I think this is one of the better books on the topic and the related issues, as well as identifying who some of the early deceivers were. But before we bring him on, here's a quick message from our sponsor, LifeWave, which is a unique product that uses light reflection to activate the body's own natural energy, supporting healing, improving performance, and combating aging without drugs or stimulants. Check them out, and then we'll be right back.
Light, the energy of life itself. Since the beginning of time, light has sustained us, fueled our growth, and shaped the world. Even Einstein recognized that everything we are is made of light. But what if we could harness the light within us, not just to live, but to renew, restore, and rejuvenate? Introducing LifeWave X39, the first product in the world that activates stem cells using our body's own light. Backed by clinical research, multiple patents, and over 10 years of stem cell research, a revolutionary wearable light technology that unlocks the power of activating our own stem cells with a single, safe, affordable, non-transdermal patch that puts you back in control of how you look, feel, and perform. Unlike drugs or chemicals, X39 works naturally, awakening your body's ability to heal and thrive. It's time to unlock your full potential, restore your vitality, and embrace a healthier, more vibrant you.
And now to our guest, Dave Benner. Hey, thanks for being with us today. How's everything going?
Good, Dave. Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate being on and for the kind words about my work.
Well, hey, I really like this book. It's not a new book. It's been out for almost 10 years. It's not too long. It's got great information, and in my opinion, it's a good reference overall. And there's things covered in here that would normally be covered probably in a whole separate book, especially when you talk about the British history aspect of it. For those in the audience not familiar with Dave, he contributes content to the 10th Amendment Center, which is a great site, by the way. That's one of my go-to sites. The Mises Institute, Abbeville Institute, and other publications. His areas of experience include the American War for Independence, the United States Constitution, and the ratification struggle, nullification, tariffs, and central banking in the United States. Also includes the antebellum period, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the American Civil War. Visit his website, davebenner.com. Now let's get right to it. Why is it important to recognize that the Constitution is a compact between the states?
Yeah, it's because that's the most unique part of America. We hear so many things in so many places about how, there's this American exceptionalism, and usually when people say that, it's saying, some kind of justification to try to police the world or something like that. But really, true American exceptionalism is decentralization, because the United States is so distinct and unique in that way with respect to the rest of the world. For instance, the French government, the central government, built all of the districts in France during the French Revolution, and it was done for the administrative convenience of the central government. But in the United States, the states predated the central government, and that's the first sentence in my book, actually. And that is so important because it shows where the power that our states and our government have derives from. It wasn't from this central authority. And ultimately, it is individuals. We believe in natural law, the ability that we have, rights from our creator bestowed to us by God. If you're not a Christian, maybe you believe that that's just an extension of your humanity or something like that. But it really shows why this was significant, because when the states actually built the general government, which we have now, the general government began to pervert the states that built it. You had, Frankenstein's monster come out and try to police the states in so many ways. And it really behooves us to go back to the history and realize like why that's significant, that we wanted the states to be the central building blocks. As Oliver Ellsworth, the Connecticut founder, said during the ratification convention, he said the states are the pillars which uphold the central government. And that's of the utmost importance in the American system.
Yeah. And I think you kind of hinted at in something that you said in terms of people who kind of wanted to veer us off. But why aren't we taught this in school? We're not taught to focus on the fact that the states created the federal government. Why is that?
Well, I think it's for the convenience of the ambitious power brokers in Washington, and the fact that much of our education system, though much funding comes from the states, much more funding comes from localities than the central government. It is the central government and its politically connected committees that actually write the textbooks, and they're written by, people on committees, bureaucrats. Oftentimes they're not teachers, they don't have background in history, but they do have an innate desire to pull people toward the idea that there should be more central power in the federal government, despite the encroachment on the states and the encroachment on individuals as an extension of that. We shouldn't be too surprised that a lot of the curriculum that children get in public schools, says that the solution to all of our problems is more
government.
Central government, the people that write the curriculum. I mean, it's the ultimate, embarrassment, and it's the ultimate conflict of interest, if you ask me.
Yeah, and we're 38 trillion in debt.
Yeah.
And so one thing too, and this is going to be hard for a lot of people, I've always referred to it for most of my life as the Revolutionary War, and most people talk about the Revolutionary War or the Revolution, but it was much more a war for independence. The revolutionary portion of it probably most of it happened before the shooting started.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, if you read what John Adams said about it, it was akin to getting 13 clocks to strike at the same time, talking about, the different colonies at that point having different interests in many regards. And I do think that the idea of this being a revolution is a little bit misguided, because the American Revolution is, again, so distinct from other revolutions in history, where, say, the French Revolution, the French radicals wanted to reinvent the entire governmental order. They wanted to abolish Christianity, replace it with a deistic religion, even wipe away the calendar and replace it with a different calendar that didn't have religious references. You had all sorts of things like that, but in the American situation, it was really more of a deed whereupon a lot of people believed that the traditional rights that they rightly held in their belief as Englishmen were being denied. And we want to preserve those rights. We don't want to revolutionize our government or our government system. That did happen to some extent by the dissolution of any monarchical extensions of British power here, but it wasn't. It was more of a conservative revolution. And Gordon Wood writes about this, I think, brilliantly in The Radicalism of the American Revolution. Great book, by the way.
I definitely want to check that one out. I haven't read that one yet. And so a lot of what we saw as our rights, these were not rights that necessarily came out of the Enlightenment, or that hey, we got together and started thinking about, hey, this should be a right, that should be no, we inherited those rights for the most part from the British, from the British Constitution and other things from our past as British citizens. Well, British subjects. I think probably one of the most revolutionary things is, okay, hey, we're no longer going to do this subject thing. We're going to be citizens, and you're going to work for us.
Yeah, that was actually the most revolutionary idea, and you had seen that at several times in the past throughout history. You had a short-lived interregnum in England under the Cromwellian Republic, where that was the case, and you had that in the Roman Republic, where citizens would be the ones dictating their own policies, dictating their own governments instead of being subjects. That is true. That was more of a radical belief among some people who thought, after the English Restoration in 1660s, when the Stuarts came back to power, hey, this thing is a failed experiment. This can never happen again. But, patriots in the United States proved them wrong. And they did it in so many ways, and they weren't always on the same page, which I think is interesting too. A lot of like mainstream history seems to like lump all the founders into one class where, basically Massachusetts and South Carolina didn't agree with on anything for, a period of several decades, even including the revolution. So just something to note.
Right, right. Now, the only thing they agreed was eventually they agreed that they needed to secede from England. Other than that,
Yeah.
everything else was kind of negotiable.
Yeah, and South Carolina was really reluctant to say we should secede from England too. I mean, you could see this in the John Adams miniseries, is that they were one of the last states to agree to that and to do, well, colonies, and to agree to that, they wanted unanimity among the other colonies. New York didn't provide it until after the war began because there was a huge British flotilla off the coast of Manhattan threatening them, and they wouldn't succumb to agreeing to, secession and ultimate independence until I think a month later. But yeah.
Right. So one of the things in this book, like I said, it talks about a lot of the early history of the things that the founders, parents, and or grandparents, great grandparents went through, and that they knew about from British history. What are some of the more significant things that were carried over to the Revolution? Or
Oh yeah,
led
let
to
me just
led to the War for Independence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, there are a few ones. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. One is just the Magna Carta. This goes all the way back to 1215, where the barons under the First Barons' War forced King John by the sword to sign a document saying that you can't just hold people indefinitely without just cause. And that has been inherited in our law as habeas corpus. That's the writ to, show proof by the government that we have the justified means to hold someone. Also, due process in general. Some of its origins in germ came from the Magna Carta. This was part of the British tradition, very much woven into the fabric of the West at that point. The other period I cover a lot in this book is mid 17th century English history, where you had the Stuart monarch, Charles I, go into an 11 years tyranny where he prorogued the government because they wouldn't support his idiotic wars. And, he replaced the bullion backed currency in England with a bronze experiment, inflating the currency. You had him trying to arrest members of Congress that stood against him in many of his political escapades. And, they had the Petition of Right, I believe, in 1624 that said, hey, some of these things that the king is engaging in is overreach. We can't accept this. And then you saw that again in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where Parliament decided to replace James II with William and Mary through something of a bloodless revolution called the Glorious Revolution. But after that, they signed the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, which said that you can't just disarm people of their arms, because that's what James II did. James II tried to take arms of Protestants that stood against him in his attempt to create something like a Catholic dynasty in England. And that, is a precursor to the Second Amendment. There's many more of these things, but those are a few of the important ones.
Okay. So after the revolution, and like you say, they weren't all on the same sheet about, and I keep saying the revolution because that's what I'm used to calling it. But after the war, before the War for Independence, they didn't all come to that same conclusion at the same time. Now, of course, there were some states that had already done a declaration before the Declaration of Independence. In fact, I think the Declaration of Independence, wasn't it largely based maybe on the Virginia or one of the other states' declarations?
Absolutely correct. Virginia declared independence of May of 1776, so invoking some of that similar tradition in the writings, they took upon it to say, hey, George Mason wrote this great document articulating why we should do this, and that went into Thomas Jefferson's knowledge of that. And you're right about that. Rhode Island, Virginia, and I believe North Carolina all seceded from Great Britain before the Continental Congress did in common cause through what was called the Lee Amendment, which was passed on July 2nd, 1776, and then the Declaration of Independence itself articulating the reasons for which the Lee Amendment passed, was on July 4th.
And so after the war, and they had the Articles of Confederation initially. Talk about those a little bit. I think they were probably too weak to work overall, but I think maybe they get a little worse rap than they deserve. Can you hit on that just a little bit?
Yeah, the Articles of Confederation was the first constitution for the United States. In fact, it was referred to that way. It was our first written constitution. It was finally ratified in 1781. So the Continental Congress had existed for 5 or 6 years at that point. Primarily, it was drafted by John Dickinson, himself a very interesting person, refused to sign the Declaration of Independence, but he also manumitted all of his slaves when, at a time where that was a radical thing to do too. But this document was a way in which to create a general agent, that being the Confederation Congress, to do things in the common cause of all the member states. And it says in the Articles of Confederation in Article 2, if you read it, that all states retain, their dignity, sovereignty, and independence. But there were going to be a few things done by this central government in the general interests of the states. That's where the idea of the general welfare clause comes from,
right,
that these powers were in the general benefit of each member state. Of course, that's been twisted and perverted by the modern government. But what's key about the Articles of Confederation is a few things. One, to me, the most distinct quality is what's called the enumerated powers doctrine. And that's a doctrine that the Constitution inherited too. And that idea is that we don't have a general legislative authority. We only have a subset of powers by which the general government can exercise authority over the United States. And in all other areas, those have to be controlled by the localities, by the states. Right. Now, if you're asking me what how good the Articles of Confederation was, I think it was a pretty good constitution. In some ways, I do think it's superior to the current constitution, but I do think it had a few defects. Namely, it was basically impossible to amend. To amend it, you had to have the consent of every single state to amend it, making it virtually unfeasible to ever change. Just think about that today. How many issues do every single state agree on? And you can see why, this thing, it might have inevitably been shelved because we can never amend it. Right. Also, if you look at Article 9 and 12 of the Articles of Confederation, it sanctions the printing of fiat currency, not only by the central government, and they inflated the currency called the Continental currency during the Revolution. It caused an economic catastrophe, but also sanctioned the states printing bills of credit, which also compounded the economic woes of people. So if you're asking me, those are the big defects, but overall, I think it's a general good document. And I know William Watkins agrees on that. You talked about him earlier, and I like William a lot.
Yeah, smart
His
guy.
book on it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. But when they did the convention at Philadelphia, they did borrow a lot. It's not like they started from scratch, because initially they said, hey, we're just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. Obviously, they went beyond that, but there is a lot from the Articles, and the understanding of a lot of key phrases came from their understanding of what those phrases meant in the Articles of Confederation, even though they got distorted or perverted after that.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. That is a fact a lot of people don't know. A lot of the clauses that you have in the Constitution today existed in a precursor form in the Articles of Confederation, a lot more than people think, because people say that this government's an entire reinvention. And in some respects, I guess that's right, but a lot of the clauses are very reminiscent of what you found there. Now, in the Philadelphia Convention, some states like New Jersey, the William Paterson Plan from New Jersey, sometimes called the New Jersey Plan, called to mostly preserve that kind of system and but create an executive power that would be spread among as many as 5 people, for instance.
Right.
Then you had James Madison's plan, the Virginia Plan,
Yep.
which did want a nationalistic stranglehold on the American people. And if you read traditional histories, a lot of people say, well, the Virginia Plan won out, but it's just not the case, because Madison's plan, and Edmund Randolph played a key role in this too, it called for a general legislative power. Remember, I hinted at that earlier. That means that the central government can exercise all powers. They didn't get that.
Right.
It called for 2 houses of Congress and a bicameral legislature, both of which would be apportioned by state populace.
Yep.
They didn't get that. Only 1 house is. They would get a supreme judiciary that had essential jurisdiction over almost every question imaginable. They didn't get that either. Now, of course, these things were perverted through
Right.
precedents, legal things, but that is the kind of the clash you saw at Philadelphia. Of course, you have, outright monarchists like Alexander Hamilton.
Right.
Presenting a monarchical plan there too, but that was the battle at the crux of the heart of the Philadelphia Convention.
Right. And so when we think about the founding fathers, I think a lot of people think, oh, they were all on the same sheet. They agreed about everything. They had the same view, and that's just not true. And of course, they changed their views over time because, as you said, Madison is the one who pushed the Virginia plan, and he wanted a top-down, and he worried a lot about state tyranny, and somehow he didn't see that the federal government itself, well, he did see, within 10 years he saw that, but those things did not win out in the convention. As you said, they were defeated in the convention. And then, of course, what they did create had to go to the states for ratification. And none of the states interpreted it that way, which is part of why we have the Bill of Rights, because they were concerned that they just wanted to make sure, because they knew that there were certain people. They knew Hamilton, what he wanted, and they knew what other people had tried for. So there's always been, in my opinion, when it comes to the Constitution, from the convention on, there was what they signed on to, and then what they wanted us to believe it meant. So you've always had, that's where the conflict has been. And it started early on, before the ink was dry.
It sure did. It started as early as 1790 when you had this Assumption Act, the idea that the general government would assume all of the states' debts. And that was even a precursor to the bigger, conflict and clash within the Washington administration on whether a central bank is constitutional. So, yeah, this was treaded on before the ink was dry, and then it gets even worse in 1798, which we could talk about later. I think you've saved some discussion for that. But yeah, this was the clash at the heart of it. Did this Constitution represent what its, fiercest opponents said it was? Well, no, otherwise the ratification itself couldn't have been secured. And you had these states like New York and Virginia where ratification was razor thin, hinged on the idea rammed down the throats of the delegates that this government would only have the powers expressly delegated to that. That's what George Nicholas in Virginia, Edmund Randolph in Virginia, James Madison in Virginia said. That's what James Iredell in North Carolina said. That's what Alexander Hamilton said in New York. That's what Fisher Ames and Theodore Sedgwick said in Massachusetts. I can go on and on. That was the general idea, and ratification was secured on that basis.
Right.
So after that, you can see, Hamilton and his political allies doing an about face and saying, hey, this necessary and proper clause opens up a vast reservoir of new powers that we always intended it to be. So that's what you have.
So John Kerry was not the original flip-flopper. It was Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, certainly so. Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, Hamilton's John Jay, his closest allies were the worst, if you're asking me.
But so there's always been that. You always had two different interpretations, even though what was decided at the convention and certainly what was ratified, because the states had to ratify this, and they were not going to ratify it if it was going to be a top-down deal.
Right, and it's not even the states necessarily that ratified it. They called specific single-issue conventions to deduce and decide this thinking that, it was much more of a high level decision, that it required such a special type of convention like that wouldn't generally be wielded by the states themselves and the state governments, because the elected officials in the states wouldn't necessarily be elected on the basis of their position on this. But in those state ratification conventions, as you note, they were populated with people being decided to be delegates based on this issue alone. So there's a lot of significance in that. And given that Article 7 of the Constitution says that 9 member states are needed to give this legal force, I think it's significant too, because a lot of people say, well, hey, the Constitution was a coup. What happened in Philadelphia was a coup. And I guess I could buy that if you're talking about like an ideological coup, but there wasn't military force to ensure this ratification. This was a voluntary act on the basis of these conventions filled by voters within their states. Now, you can say that that still isn't, completely ideal, because, we'd want individuals to sign contracts and not these conventions to decide that for the people, but it was much more representative of the people than basically any act in government in United States history, because of how this was uniquely arranged, if you're asking me.
Yeah. Well, and I know it goes back to the whole Article 5 convention deal, but the legislatures, they allowed these conventions to be set up, or asked them to be set up, whatever. But it goes back to what you said. If it had just gone to the state legislature, it would have had to have been unanimous. And so they knew it was not going to go that way. I mean, they knew that there was no use to send it that way. That's why they had to go with 9, understanding that the Constitution they were currently under required unanimous consent. So they had to do something different if they were going to get this through. So yeah, you could say they didn't actually follow their Constitution. I don't know that they had a way to, I don't know that there was any other way they could have done it other than saying, okay, we got to have a lesser number here, and if enough agree. But now here's the thing too, and I know you know this, and this is just for the audience. So one of the big arguments was, right after it was ratified, you had people like John Marshall, a Supreme Court Justice. Well, it was ratified by the people as a whole. And that's how they tried to push this nationalist interpretation of it, versus the fact that it was ratified 9 states. Okay, it was not a total number of bodies in the population. It was 9 states, but they still tried to push that.
Yeah, they did. You're exactly right about that. That's how they dupe people into this belief that it created kind of this central government, and it was never intended to be that. You mentioned Marshall, but also this became part of what's called kind of the nationalist narrative on American ratification that Joseph Story put into his famous 1833 commentaries, I believe, on the Constitution, where he wrote and, extrapolated on that idea that this Constitution was ratified by one people in the aggregate, and it's just totally ahistorical, and it was used to just kind of justify a perversion of the original intent of the Constitution, where Amendment 10 explicitly said what was implied in the ratification of the Constitution originally, and that's that all powers not delegated to the general government are to be controlled by the states and the people. And that's what Thomas Jefferson called the cornerstone of the federal Constitution in his 1791 opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. And I totally agree with Jefferson. That was the cornerstone, and you can see that said time and time again in the state ratification conventions when this was a controversy.
Oh yeah, well that's the thing too. The ratification conventions were held before the Bill of Rights were added, but, there was such a concern that, hey, we need a Bill of Rights. That was one of the things Madison had to promise. Okay, look, I'll bring it up in the first Congress. And he did. And all those issues, and the one issue that's brought up in almost every state ratification convention is what we now call the 10th Amendment. They were all worried that they were recreating what they just fought to get out of.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, like many of the state ratification ordinances, if you read them today, toward the end of them, it lists their desired amendments that should be part of a prospective Bill of Rights. And you're exactly right. That was number 1 on many of the states' lists. And then when this was aggregated and collated by Madison in the first Congress, that was actually at the top of the list. So That was at the forefront of people's desire to guarantee about this government, because they had to, the advocates of the Constitution, the Federalists, they had to keep assuring representatives that didn't like this thing, that scoffed at it,
Right.
criticized it, etc., that it's not going to do what you're saying, where they can exercise powers not delegated. And this came up especially in Massachusetts, where you had Samuel Adams and John Hancock, for instance, initially against the Constitution on this basis.
Yep.
But then they were won over by persuasion within their ratification convention. And then you had John Hancock, toward the end of Massachusetts ratification convention, launch into a grand speech saying that he supports it on this basis. And there will be a Bill of Rights. We won't accept not having a Bill of Rights. That helped secure ratification in Massachusetts, for instance. So this was really important.
And Massachusetts was a key state at that time, as was Virginia. It was huge. New York was, the Federalist Papers were written for New York. Don't think they really had a whole lot of impact. Probably got more use
Correct.
after that, because I think Virginia ratified right before New York, and New York's like, well, okay, done deal. We got to ratify. They've got the numbers, and we're not going to be left out. And then, of course, we did have the two holdouts were Rhode Island and North Carolina that didn't ratify till a couple years later. But it's people need to understand, because it's important to understand that this was supposed to be state-centric, not a federal government that just uses the states as, basically a federal agency, a subordinate agency. It definitely, and even though early on people tried to pervert it, you mentioned Marshall and others, the Jefferson tradition, that of, hey, limited government, the states are the shot callers, and the federal government has limited powers, that lasted for a good while. And it was strong, and not just in the South, but it was throughout. It was strong. Obviously, it was stronger in some places than others. You want to talk a little bit about the Jefferson tradition? When did the Jefferson tradition end, do you think?
Well, you can put it at a lot of watershed moments. I think that 1865 is a pretty good one to put it at. But
Right.
you're right. You're absolutely right. And Dave, I'm very impressed by your knowledge. This is exactly right, that the states were supposed to be the building blocks that upheld the general system. It was the states that predated the Constitution, then created the Constitution, and by extension, the federal government. So the states actually created the federal government. And you talked about ratification. You're exactly right. North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't ratify right away. I think it took Rhode Island about almost a year and a half after Washington was sworn in to ratify. And what's key is how these states existed and how the federal government treated them. Did they roll in the militia to try to use coercion to coerce these states into the Union? No, not whatsoever. They were actually independent republics.
Yep.
And we know, for instance, in North Carolina's example, a guy named Hugh Williamson, very important founder a lot of people don't know about, he actually served as an ambassador, the first ambassador of North Carolina's General Republic to the United States. And
Oh, wow.
their relationship was a good one. He tried to lobby the federal government to accept a Bill of Rights that would be acceptable to North Carolina in order to ratify. Also is the example of Vermont, where it was an independent republic until the early 1790s, where it finally joined into the American Union. Again, the federal government didn't use coercion against Vermont to try to bring it into the Union. And that's what the Jefferson and the Jeffersonian tradition is all about. I think that the key moment of the Jeffersonian tradition, though, is in 1798, when you got what was called the Sedition Act, one of the Alien and Sedition Acts, one of 4 acts, the most egregious of which was the Sedition Act, that penalized bringing the federal government into ill repute. And specifically, if you read the law, it criminalizes bringing either the president or members of Congress into ill repute.
Minus
but
the
not
vice president.
Yeah,
Minus
but
the
not-
vice president, because that was Jefferson at the time.
Yeah, but not the vice president, because that was Jefferson. So literally, you could have as much of as a $2,000 charge and serve as many as 2 years in jail for criticizing John Adams. One man during a cannon procession said that he hoped that the cannon was fired at John Adams' ass. And for that, he was thrown into prison. and received a $2,000 fine. Well, this was atrocious. It was a complete violation of liberty and the Constitution. And Thomas Jefferson and Madison and leading Republicans got together at Monticello and devised a strategy for this, to deal with this. But it really was just an extension of what the delegates were told at the ratification conventions. They said that the states created the federal government, and we shouldn't allow the federal government to have the power of interpretation over all aspects of the system, especially when it perverts it. And the states, at last resort, should be the emperor or the umpire to decide when the federal government has violated its most basic tenets. So in gobbledygook, I'm saying that the states were able to determine that the federal government was acting mischievously, violating the Constitution, and ignoring liberties. And because of that, they would actively try to thwart, using state resources, the exertion and enforcement power of the federal government. Kevin Gutzman writes a lot about this in his works on Jefferson, but what you had was in Richmond, they started drilling militia forces to take on the federal government in a possible military clash. And, Virginia stood against these things. Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions, and Madison wrote the Virginia resolutions, both of which entered into the records of those respective states and passed. We also know, due to a historian named Wendell Bird, in a famous article in 2015, if you're into constitutional law, that similar resolutions were drafted and adopted by the governments of both Tennessee and Georgia. That's a fact a lot of people don't know. But this was a widespread thing to dig our heels in to prevent this evil. As Madison said, it was for arresting the progress of evil that these resolutions were written. So sorry, I went off forever. But
no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because what you hear from the so-called mainstream is, they wrote the Alien and Sedition, or they wrote the resolutions, the nullification resolutions, but they were pretty much ignored. All the other states rebuked them. Nobody went along with it, and that's BS, and it's BS on 2 points. Number one, like you said, and I read that recently, matter of fact, and I've forgotten the guy's name, about Tennessee and I think Georgia.
Correct.
And some other
Wendell
states.
Bird.
So there were other states that did, in fact, go along with these but here's what's the really interesting thing is, when Jefferson was president, and later when Madison was president, at different times, some of these New England states fell back on the same ideas that were outlined in the articles, the Acts in 1798.
That's exactly right. I'm so glad you bring that up too, Dave, because what you had, especially as a result of the War of 1812, was this Northern cause dug in on the basis of Jefferson and Madison's acts, and that became known as the Principles of 98, the shorthand for nullification.
I couldn't remember it. I'm glad you said that. I couldn't remember it.
Yeah, and what you had at one point during the War of 1812 was Madison entertained the idea of conscripting minors to fight against the British in the War of 1812. And this was very much to the chagrin of northern states that didn't want to fight this war. They considered it a Virginia war. And they went so far as to organize their own convention called the Hartford Convention, where the idea of some proposals on the table were literally to secede from the Union, such that this didn't have to happen. But then you had Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, as you said, a very important state, say, hey, we need to invoke the Principles of 98. Jefferson and Madison were right. We just need to apply that theory to this current crisis and not let our young lads serve in this pernicious war. So you did see northern states do this when it was convenient to them. I don't know necessarily it was, as kind of an honest ideological extension of their own views of the Constitution as it was in Jefferson's case, but it was part of the American tradition, the constitutional order, that both northern and southern states at various times embraced these ideas, but now they've been totally thrown by the wayside in, academia and political discourse, etc.
It all started in 1832. As far as
the nullification crisis.
So, and because the Articles of 98 they were ignored at the time by everybody. But now, on the War of 1812, didn't that involve raising troops in addition to what you mentioned, also to invade Canada? I think we were wanting to invade Canada, and they were like, hey, wait a minute, this militia is to defend the state, not to invade another country.
Yeah, that was one of the leading arguments too. Some people did not want to fight in that war whatsoever, but yeah, the Canadian invasion was seen as something that was totally un-American. Just imagine that. The idea of conquest outside of America was un-American in many circles, even though now you have a U.S. empire building experiment basically everywhere throughout the world. But that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that too, Dave.
So you already mentioned that Marshall and Hamilton, despite what they said during the ratification, once everything's ratified, I mean, they're already trying to reinterpret the Constitution and make it a national document. And of course, they used some of the same they used the clauses they referred to were the exact clauses that the Anti-Federalists who had opposed the Constitution said would be abused. Necessary and proper clause, general welfare clause, commerce, all those clauses, the supremacy clause, judicial clause, all of them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly can. I devoted a full chapter of that in my book, so you mentioned a few of them. So let's just take them on one thing about each of them. So, necessary and proper clause. This was a clause added to the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 to allow for incidental, pre-power exertion processes that would be required to carry out the enumerated powers. The intent behind it was to allow the original enumerated powers to be brought out. But in the 1791 opinion of Alexander Hamilton on the basis of the constitutionality of a national bank, he said, no, the necessary and proper clause allows us to create this central bank itself to carry out some of the other powers. They would be done more efficiently if we did that.
Convenience. They use the word convenience. Yeah.
Yeah. For the Commerce Clause, this was intended to regulate trade among the states. And really, you had this idea of a free trade zone that would kind of contravene what you had in the 1780s in the Articles of Confederation, where a lot of the states enacted tariffs against other states to prevent goods and services from flowing in. And you had essentially a trade war within the American colonies. A lot of people don't know about that. A lot of people aren't taught that. But the idea of regulation was meant to make regular, to allow this trade to happen. And what the federal government has taken it to be since then is the idea that you can regulate every single behavior that occurs even within a state. Not even having to do with multiple states. You have egregious constitutional opinions like Wickard versus Filburn that happened in the 1930s, where the federal judiciary said, if you grow an excess amount of wheat on your own property, even if you don't sell it to someone else, even if you just consume it yourself or your family, then you're violating the Commerce Clause because that affects the market of wheat throughout the country. Just these absurd notions. General Welfare Clause. One more thing about that. So, like I said, there was a General Welfare Clause in the Articles of Confederation. It was meant to be basically an indicator that the powers that the federal government was given were powers deemed convenient to the individual states. They were in the general benefit of the states. But politicians today look at that clause and say, hey, that allows us to do everything we consider generally and properly and orderly. Every tyrant that ever existed claimed to be doing what they're doing for the general benefit of the people. So it just throws the idea of a limited enumerated powers constitution out the window when you can just say everything's for the general welfare of the states. So that's what I'd say about those things.
Yeah. So, like I said, the book, for a less than 400-page book, it's got some great information, and it lays that out. It lays out, the problems caused by Hamilton and Marshall with the courts. The courts were a problem early on. I think they got to be more of a problem later, and I want to talk about that here in a second. And you hit all the clauses, and of course you got all the supporting documents in the back here. So if somebody that's out there that doesn't know a lot about our history, I would definitely recommend this book. It is a great book. Now, we're not finished yet because I want to hit something else. Now, obviously this ended in, as you say, 1865, and then but it's gotten worse since then. And the way that it is now is not necessarily how it had to be after the end of the Civil War. I mean, the end of the Civil War, it was no longer a voluntary union. Okay, it was no longer a republic made up of it was a no, you can't leave. All right, that's a huge change. You know, people talk about the lost cause. Well, the lost cause was the republic that the founders gave us. That was the lost cause. Forget the whole slave thing. It was what we lost. And then, of course, later on, I think the next two real significant things that really cause us problems today are the 16th and 17th Amendment. But without the 16th, the 17th wouldn't mean anything, because the 16th is what allows all the bribery and all the coercion. That in videotape today, I'm sure. But there was something that happened after the Civil War, the passage of the 14th Amendment. And you've got another book on the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine. First off, before we get to this, is there anything else, anything else that you want to say about this book and this period?
I'll say something really short, is that the founders were a generation of secessionists. You know, there's nothing you hear more today than the idea that secession is treason, but our founding generation succeeded from two governments. Number one, the British Crown, through which they declared their independence and common cause in the Declaration of Independence that listed the cause that impelled them to the separation.
Right.
And then they seceded from the Articles of Confederation to create what they called a more perfect union. That was a secession too. It was disregarding and disbanding from a previous government and forming a new one. That, you know, this idea that the founders, you know, had these ideas and we're supposed to, you know, give them lip service at times, but not acknowledge what really was the cornerstone apple pie American principle, which was secession, is wrong. And I think that is a big part of the book.
Absolutely. Great book, great book. So at the end of the Civil War, and I'm not going to get into all the causes and all that, and, you know, we could do a whole hour on how bad Lincoln really was. But the 14th Amendment basically just said, okay, look, you cannot have separate laws for the whites and the now freed slaves. That's what the Due Process Clause was about. That's what the due process, equal protection. That's what it was all about. And it referenced, the rights it referenced were from Article 4 of the Constitution. It didn't say anything about Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights, as we've talked about, is a restriction on the federal government, not on state governments. And after the 14th was passed in 1868, of course, I call it the fraudulent 14th because everything about the way it was done was fraudulent. First off, you had states that they say were no longer in the Union had to vote for it. You had to vote for it to get back in. Figure that one out, okay? And then they probably still didn't even have enough votes. So there was all kinds of problems with it. But all the same, the biggest problem with the 14th Amendment really didn't start until the 20th century. And with the doctrine of incorporation. Once again, guys, this is a very short book. You could read this book in probably 30 minutes at the most and get a good, thorough understanding of the doctrine of incorporation, which is a court-created doctrine from hell, by the way, okay? That is all it is. It has caused us so much problems. The 14th Amendment and the judicial systems has become a whole separate constitution, and that is the source of a lot of our problems today. So, talk about incorporation and talk about some of the problems that it's created.
Yeah, Dave, you put it perfectly. So the 14th Amendment, there were various aspects of it, some of which basically repudiated any debt held by the Confederate States. There was another provision that reversed the Dred Scott decision. But as you say, I think it's the first section of the 14th Amendment that talks about privileges and immunities and due process of law. What happened then was they were drafting the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that was bestowing upon the freemen, not even bestowing, but guaranteeing their most basic rights could not be perverted in any state. But they looked at that and said, this is actually unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows us to pass this. And let's say the Democrats get back in power, they're going to either smack this down through legislative law or through the courts. So we have to have this 14th Amendment to constitutionalize it. Now, you said there are problems with the 14th Amendment's ratification. I think it's not properly ratified, and many prominent American historians have actually made that case. But here's what is the problem. So what the proponents of the law said was, indeed, this was extending to the new freedmen the same rights that were held by whites in their respective states. So nothing that a white didn't have in their respective states was going to be bestowed to the blacks. It was just to put the blacks on an equal playing field with the whites in every state. Well, this amendment, supposedly ratified, 55 years pass and you don't have this idea of, well, for whatever reason, this incorporates this federal Bill of Rights as limitations upon the states. But that idea did come into place in 1925 with Gitlow versus New York, where they said the First Amendment is incorporated upon the states. The states, can't necessarily infringe upon free speech, because they can't penalize a guy who called for the overthrow of the government in New York. That's what happened there. The state did not allow that under its law. And as a libertarian, I don't think that you should impugn or punish someone that calls for the overthrow of the government, by the way. I think that's an extension of your free speech. But it's not the 14th Amendment that guaranteed that. And again, we have a federal system by which the state bills of rights and state constitutions are important. So what you had 56 years, I think, after the ratification of the 14th Amendment is the federal courts invented this new idea of incorporation, where we're essentially going to be a judicial oligarchy that polices the states when they don't do what we would like them to do. They don't toe the line we would like them to toe. So in doing that, we're going to invent this doctrine which says that the 14th Amendment, in addition to doing what I just described, also holds against the states the ability to it prevents them from transgressing on the first 8 amendments. And this is absurd too when you consider, like, for instance, the First Amendment says that
Congress shall make no law.
Congress shall make no law. Exactly right. And there were state religions, state subsidized religions, all the way up until 1833 in Connecticut that existed. But they're going to say that they intended to incorporate the First Amendment against the states. Well, that would have been a loony idea. Even Marshall said that was a loony idea in one of his decisions, and it's slipping my mind right now.
Barron versus
Baltimore.
Yeah.
Barron versus Baltimore. Yeah. So that's the idea, Dave. It's hard to explain this, but that's the idea.
So from 1791 all the way through the Civil War, the first case of that was Baltimore, Barron versus Baltimore, and Marshall. And Marshall was a nationalist, so any remotely, I won't say legitimate, but even he understood that the Bill of Rights were limits on the federal government, not on the state governments. Okay, so he didn't even try to distort that. After the 14th Amendment was passed, within a few years, there was a slaughterhouse case in 1873.
Yeah.
And they said, no, this did not incorporate. There was actually one before that, but I can't remember what it was. And so for 50 years, the understanding by the courts was, no, it does not incorporate the Bill of Rights. So when they decided in 1925 that they weren't just putting words that weren't in the amendment, they were also ignoring all the courts prior that had said, no, this does not incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to be clear, one of the advocates of the 14th Amendment was John Bingham. There's a great book about this called Government by Judiciary by Raoul Berger. That's the preeminent book on this if you want like a long read on it. But you can see some passages where he wanted this to be the case, but none of his allies in Congress pushing this 14th Amendment agreed with him on that. There's specific quotes that Raoul Berger brings up saying that he was, put on the spot as being wrong, that this amendment didn't do that. It wasn't even in the wording itself, and the wording's pretty significant too. So you're right. For 55 years, there were the slaughterhouse cases. I wasn't aware of a previous case that had adjudicated the potential legitimacy of incorporation, but it didn't come into being until 56 years later, where for the first time the feds assumed this authority, and this has colored our modern political system in so many ways. You put it perfectly when you said this perverted the Constitution and in a way made our own new Constitution in this order that allows for a central judiciary and a central court system in which 5 people essentially have power over 330 million. It just wasn't what the founders wanted.
No, not at all. And so it just got worse from there. And they didn't do it all at once. So you would think if they found in 1925 that it incorporated the First Amendment, well, wait a minute. How could it do it selectively? It either did all the first 8 or it didn't. And oh, by the way, if it did that, then it would have voided the 9th and 10th Amendment. So it's just insane. And the last one that was incorporated wasn't until 2010. The Second Amendment wasn't incorporated until 2010. That just makes no sense. But we as a people have accepted this. We have allowed the courts, and I'm going to say this, and I'm probably pissing people off, I don't really care. There are a few good lawyers out there that understand this and recognize this, okay? And I'm sure that there are a few judges. But every day in this court, every day in the court in this country, if you're referring to the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, any section of it, through the 14th Amendment, you are perverting the Constitution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we weren't supposed to have a judiciary that was this powerful. And what's so ironic is, as I brought up earlier, Madison wanted a judiciary with a lot of power. Yep. And that was completely rejected by the Philadelphia Convention for a judiciary that would only have original jurisdiction in a few areas. And ultimately, it was an appellate court for most of its powers. But now we have a judiciary that is an oligarchy, and there's massive deference to that institution from both Congress and the president. It essentially has the ability to bind all 3 branches to its own interpretations of the Constitution, something that Thomas Jefferson said, was a complete travesty. He wrote a lot of correspondence about the rising power in the central court system, and that was before it became this perverted in the 1920s. And we have legal courses right now in curriculum that just starts with this idea that the 14th Amendment is the preeminent amendment. That is the cornerstone of our Constitution, but it's not the amendment as was supposedly ratified. It's the amendment that has been invented over the course of legal precedents that just give judges more and more power, all to the detriment of the localities that should have the power to adjudicate those disputes. And that's the purpose of state constitutions. You're essentially negating a state constitution's efficacy or legitimacy by saying, well, no, this federal Bill of Rights just overrides all that stuff. But that's not how it was looked at the time.
The idea of a federal Bill of Rights, based on what we understand of the Bill of Rights, that turns the Bill of Rights on its head. And the sad thing is, and I'm sure in Article 3, Section 2, Congress can restrict the appellate jurisdiction of the courts. And they can make regulations for the courts. Most of the power the courts have come from judiciary acts. Well, who does the judiciary acts? That's Congress. So this idea that the court was intended to be, you can't justify it based on what's in here, and you can't even justify it based on what they've done since 1925, because they totally fabricated it, created it. And if we're ever going to fix this country, this has got to be addressed. This has got to be addressed. We have to reject this. Now, I know that's a long shot. I know all the damn lawyers are laughing, and you know what you can do with it. But this is screwing our country up more than anything the government does. Think about all the things, regardless of where you stand on the issue, the abortion issue, gay marriage, even the Second Amendment, all those things. Now, we might like an opinion every now and then. It may go our way. But if you're deferring to the court, you are further perverting our Constitution. If
That's exactly right.
If they're using the 14th Amendment, incorporation of the 14th Amendment, it's a total perversion, in my opinion.
Totally agree with you, Dave. And even if they get it right for instance, to preserve someone's liberty, if you think that the state engages in egregious violations of a person's liberty, which it does, we saw that during the COVID regime,
Right.
for instance. But it starts a precedent by which, well, in the future, because that happened, that power was unjustly held by the federal government, it becomes a precedent to then be used to oppress you or your group in the future once your chosen faction loses power. And we've seen this, progress through the annals of history, become more and more powerful. So I'm totally with you, Dave. We're supposed to have a federalistic system. That's the point. We're not American exceptionalism in regard to our foreign policy. We embrace American exceptionalism in the structure of our government, which is decentralized. It's the best part of America, if you're asking me. And we're losing out to these supervillains in Washington, D.C. And it's not just through the wars and the welfare state. It's also through the judicial oligarchy.
Oh, yeah. And they've been, but like I say, if the people understood, Congress can put a stop to this.
Yeah,
whether
judicial
Congress
stripping.
realizes it or not, it's there in the Constitution.
Yeah,
but
the
we don't
Constitution.
understand that. We don't. Most people don't understand it. They don't believe it, and they're like, "Oh, well, whatever the court says is what we have to do." I'm like, "You got to be kidding me!" I mean, think about it. I mentioned this earlier. Is that really what the founders intended? Guys, we got to win this war so our descendants can be ruled by 5-4 Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, under the Constitution, there wasn't even an obligation to have a subordinate court below the Supreme Court.
That's right.
All the Constitution requires is a Supreme Court. So the outgrowth of the federal court system and the power it holds would have been alien to the founders that ratified it. It just would have.
Yeah. And the only jurisdiction that cannot be restricted by the Congress is the original jurisdiction, which doesn't cover a whole lot. Wouldn't affect most of us.
It's like 4 different types of cases, indeed.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to see every federal court dissolved. Absolutely every federal court dissolved. We'd be much better off as a country. Anything else you want to say about this one?
No, just I'm glad you've taken interest into that one. This subject is niche, but it's an important subject. And, some lawyers know what you're talking about if you're talking about incorporation, but the layman doesn't. It can be a dry subject, but I think you're totally right in seeing this as something that is undermining the original conception of the American Republic in ways that it doesn't cross the American eyes as easy. We see all these things in regard to like corporate welfare and spending and wars and things like this, but this is hidden beneath the surface, a structural, toxicity in our government that is going to undermine it. So I'm totally with you on it.
Yeah. Well, I just hope that we can get some traction on this because, right now when you're taking anybody who's taken an oath to the Constitution, you think you're taking an oath to the Constitution, but you're really taking an oath, de facto oath, to the perversion of the Constitution. That's really what you're doing these days. And that really irritates me. I'm retired military, and, I knew some of this stuff when I was in. I know more now, and the more I know, the more I get pissed off about it. So, anyway. Well, hey, closing thoughts?
Oh, no, just thanks for having me. I'm very impressed with your array of knowledge on this stuff. Usually people that interview me on this stuff doesn't have nearly the same breadth of your knowledge to be able to talk about this stuff fluently. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your program and all it does to promote nullification and, rejecting incorporation and getting back to the best ideas of our founding generation. I mean, you were right when you said that the founders disagreed with each other on a lot, and they did. But what we need to learn is the best things that come from our republic where it's decentralized nature, where we could have this sorting process on the basis of a man's independent desires to go where they want to in a system that's more preferable to them, a state that's more preferable to them.
Yep.
And we're losing and losing and losing the ability to do that more and more. You still see a semblance of it, of course, in the states where state governments have powers, but it's much, much less and much less ideal than what we saw in the original American Republic.
Oh, absolutely. And when you bring up nullification or something like that, the lawyers will always say, "Oh, it'll be chaos." Well, I think the courts have done pretty good job at chaos. And in the states right now, we don't have the same laws in every state. If you get a law license in Tennessee, that doesn't entitle you to practice law in other states. You get a medical license, That doesn't entitle you to go practice medicine in another state. I think most professions like that, and like I say, the laws are not the same. Is that chaos? It's not chaos.
That was the original intent.
Yes, absolutely. For number one, that was the original intent. Number two, this incorporation doctrine has created more chaos and more division in our country than anything else, in my opinion.
Yeah, right on, man. You're so right about that. I mean, every criticism of nullification is actually a criticism of the existing system. To call it chaotic would be an understatement when you're talking about $38 trillion in debt. You mentioned that. Wars on the horizon, possible regime change in Venezuela. You have a war that's been going on over 2 decades in Somalia, a war ongoing in Yemen, a war that's a proxy war versus Russia and Ukraine, war versus Iran recently. You have all these catastrophes, all this spending, all this corporate welfare, and it all leads to this centrally oriented juggernaut that perverts our rights, and it does so by violating the Constitution. And when you have both parties basically giving the Constitution at times lip service, but then picking and choosing what they want and just completely, just taking a dump on parts that they don't, it's a horrible experience.
Yep, absolutely. Well, hey, I appreciate what you do. Do you have another book coming out anytime soon?
I don't, but I actually wrote this one in 2022. It's a biography on Thomas Paine called Thomas Paine, A Lifetime of Radicalism. It's, I think, the most complete biography on Paine ever wrote. I really am. I read everything on Paine and put it into the best book I possibly could. I'm particularly proud of that one because I learned to be a better writer over time, and that one is more recently released. So that's one that I have written too. I love Thomas Paine, even though that I think he was wrong in some regards, but he was a true hero.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. Well, hey, thanks again for being with us. We'll definitely have you back. Want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Thanks to David Bolivan for a very generous donation recently. We appreciate that. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. Find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Knox for Liberty is hosting a Bill of Rights fundraiser on the 18th for Monty Fritz. Doors open at 5:30, dinner at 7 p.m. No tickets at the door. And actually, the deadline, I think, may have passed for getting tickets, but never know. They may have a few extras if you get online right now, and you might still be able to secure one. Our guest for next week will be Greg Hearn from Australia. He will talk about how Islamists there are unfortunately gaining ground and about the attack at Bondi Beach. There will not be a second show next week. That's the week of Christmas. Hope you can join us next week. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.